But first, I'd like to start off with the introduction of Alan Hess, who's our first presenter. I was looking over these bios and trying to trim some down, but this was also interesting. I want to read the whole bio. So you have the bios in your packet as well. But Alan is an architect and historian. He's written 19 books, not 18, but 19 books, on modern architecture, urbanism, and mid-20th century. He's written monographs on architects Oscar Niemeyer, Frank Lloyd Wright, and John Lautner, as well as architectural histories of Las Vegas and Palm Springs. His other books include Googie, Ultramodern Roadside Architecture, Forgotten Modern, and The Ranch House. His current book is on California modern architecture of 1900 to 1975, as well as researching the architecture of Irvine, California, one of the United States' largest master plan communities of the 60s and 70s. He was a National Arts Journal Program Fellow at Columbia University School of Journalism, received a grant from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, to research the work of Brazilian landscape architect Roberto Beryl Marx. He also has a Master of Architecture degree from the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Planning at UCLA. Alan has been active in preservation of post-World War II architecture and has qualified several buildings for the National Register of Historic Places, including the oldest McDonald's drive-in restaurant from 1953 in Downey, the Edward Durrell Stone's Stewart Pharmaceutical Factory in Pasadena, and Beckett's Bullocks in Pasadena, and Edwards Varney's Valley Home Motor Hotel from 1957. So please welcome Alan Hess.
Good morning. Glad to be here in San Diego and with all of you as well. What I'm going to be talking about this morning is kind of a framework to understand and identify historic resources of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm going to get into some specific types and try to understand show you a lot of pictures of them. What are the defining characteristics so that you can identify these. But I also want to provide a little bit of background, a little bit of kind of history so that we might be able to understand better why these would be historic. How do they fit into the larger story? The thing is that, as David mentioned, I nominated the oldest McDonald's in the nation to the National Register. It did qualify. That was in 1983. I hate to think, it's been historic longer than it actually was before. It was built in 1953, became a landmark in 83, and now we're 30-some years later. And at the time, in the early 1980s, I have to admit, even preservationists laughed. The idea of making a landmark out of McDonald's was a punchline. It was not a serious thing, but it had its reasons. It was part of American history. It was a piece of design that reflected its period and so forth. So over and over, I have seen this cycle, and this is one of the things I want to kind of emphasize. This cycle where a style, a type, a building, an architect go out of favor, and their buildings are demolished, destroyed, altered, etc. And then they eventually and almost inevitably come back into style. And so our jobs as preservationists is kind of to hit that cycle at the right point, to make sure that too many of these buildings don't get torn down before their value, what they offer to our cities, is lost. And that is kind of my big understanding of why our jobs are important. We're not just saving individual buildings, we are saving cities. We're saving the livability, the diversity, the interest, the economic appeal of cities which are provided by historic buildings. So, that said, let's get on to the pretty pictures. That's the important thing. No, that's that. There we go. Okay, got it. Okay, and being here in San Diego, I have to start out by just acknowledging, paying honor to what has been going on here in San Diego for over 100 years. I am writing this book now on the overview of California modern architecture from about 1900 up into the mid-70s as well. And I do find that the story of San Diego has been woefully underplayed. Even somebody like Irving Gill. I mean, Irving Gill is acknowledged internationally now as a very important architect. But why? What is it about him? What was he doing? And why was he doing it at that time? There are all of these questions that are not understood. We need to dig underneath the surface. Yes, Irving Gill is an important name, but we need to dig underneath the surface to find out what was going on here in San Diego at that time. Who else was he working with, et cetera? In order to understand really why he is important and all of the people that came after. So these are just a few. And I apologize for, to Sim Bruce Richards and Ken Kellogg and a number of other architects that should be in this collage here. But of course, Lloyd Rocco, Russell Forrester, Henry Hester. These are names that you are familiar with, I'm sure, but they should be as familiar statewide as many of the other better known names. For example, and again, this is kind of a model that not only in San Diego, but Bakersfield and the Monterey Peninsula and other areas in California really need to follow. These are, of course, Palm Springs architects. Upper left-hand corner is a coffee shop, a Googie coffee shop by William Cody. On the upper right is one of the prefab metal buildings by Donald Wexler. Lower left is Albert Frey's house for himself. And lower right is the Palm Springs Art Museum by E. Stuart Williams. Now, about 15, 20 years ago, these architects also were completely unknown outside of the Palm Springs area. But because of efforts by Palm Springs Modernism Week, Palm Springs Preservation Foundation, Palm Springs Modernism Committee, and other groups, these names are bubbling to the surface. These are names that are more generally known. That certainly helps the preservation of these buildings, but also it keeps these incredible contributions of these great architects at our forefront. This is part of our job, I think, is to not only build great buildings now, but to become part of an ongoing heritage and a recognition of an ongoing heritage. So San Diego is just incredible. And I know there are many of you here in the audience who are really focused on this and doing great work, and I thank you for that. So moving on to 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what are they all about? And what should we care about in them? Now, the term modernism tends to be thrown around pretty lightly. And too often, certainly in the popular media, it tends to be focused on one narrow part of the modern movement. And that is the movement which came out of the Bauhaus. That's the Walter Gropius's Bauhaus building on the top, or the international style, the glass boxes, skyscrapers of Mies van der Rohe, or Richard Neutra's work, the Kaufman House on Palm Springs as well. And these all have a very distinctive character of modernism. They are modern, but they're not all of modernism. But again, the popular press and even preservationists and historians tend to focus on these buildings. They're abstract, geometric, usually flat roofs, expressive of their structure, whether it's steel or wood or concrete or whatever. Use of modern materials, glass, steel, etc. This is all, again, I have to emphasize, these are all legitimately modern, but there's so much more to modern. I see modernism not just as an expression of modern technology, but as an era of experiment, of taking the technology that modern industry had provided and then experimenting with it in so many extraordinary ways, and that's what we're going to be getting into. So there are a couple of different labels which I'm going to give to these, and these are rough, but I think they will at least help you kind of organize your thoughts when you're looking. I'm hoping that after looking at these examples I'm going to be talking about, that when you're driving around San Diego, you'll be able to see these examples and identify them. Then the next question is, what's good, what's bad? And we'll be exploring that a little bit as well. We'll be looking at late modern buildings. We'll be looking at brutalist buildings. We'll be looking at postmodern buildings. We're going to be looking at, I think probably surprisingly to a number of people, buildings which are sustainable from the 60s and 70s as well. They were interested, there were good architects interested in that. So the thing is that I showed you, well, just, modernism. The Bauhaus was founded in 1919. Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, a whole host of European architects developed these ideas. And they became very powerful, spread globally, really, so that they were given the name, probably an unfortunate coinage, I have to admit at this point. They were given the name of the international style. And that was due to Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, who in 1932 did an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and they titled it the International Style. So it was from the beginning proclaimed rhetorically as the coming style, the ultimate style, the style of the world, the international style. Anything else, anything going on in San Diego then was derivative. It was secondary. It was regional. It was maybe even a bastardization of the international style, the measure of all good. So, however, again, 1919, the Bauhaus was founded and moves on, especially after World War II. The international style becomes a dominant style in corporate and institutional architecture. But it was also getting boring. Many architects and the public at that point were saying, well, why do we have to have so many buildings that look like factories? Why do we have to have so many flat roofed buildings? Why can't we have some ornament? Why does it have to be just a blank curtain wall on the front of all these buildings that we're seeing? And there were many, we'll be getting into that, many really very serious architects, Robert Venturi, Charles Moore, and others, who were looking at this, from the standpoint of theory and what should architecture be. But then there were these architects who were exploring those ideas and saying, yeah, architecture doesn't have to be just this minimalist box that expresses its function, but not much more. And one of those is William Pereira, and he's a favorite of mine right now. We're fighting a very uphill battle to try to save the LA County Museum of Art in Los Angeles from 1965 by William Pereira. But what I wanted to show, and that's, you see a detail of that on the left, the Amundsen building as well. But I have discovered in my research on Pereira, and there's almost no research on Pereira. This is another part of our jobs that I want to emphasize here. Research, documentation, archives are so incredibly important in order that we can understand what this story is. There is one book on William Pereira. It's not all that good. It doesn't even have an index. There was one exhibit on William Pereira's work in 2013, and it was in Reno at the Nevada Art Museum in Reno. it was very good, very done. Not large, but really, really in depth. But in my own research on William Pereira, that I've just kind of scrabbled together from looking at the buildings and talking to a couple of people and so forth, I've discovered that this building on the right, which is the Metropolitan Water District building in Los Angeles, turns out to be a really key turning point in his career as he was developing something beyond international style modernism. And he was very interested in that. And it's really important to know that he was doing this in California, Los Angeles in particular, though here in San Diego, of course, also. He was looking at the modern age, not from the standpoint of the Bauhaus and the European social history of the 19-teens and 20s and 30s, but he was looking at it from the standpoint of California. California at this time, growing, booming, aerospace, entertainment, new media, all of these new modern social industries, and then the social culture that came from it as well, developing here in California. This was the base that William Pereira and others were drawing from. So, in the Metropolitan Water District, he was still a modernist. He believed in the tenets of modernism, structural expression, but he said we can do more with it. So, for example, in this building, you see the structure expressed, these twin columns, which were part of the structure, exposed, even brought out, of outriggers all the way around the building. And then notice the sunscreens here. These are sunscreens. There's glass windows behind them. But he is taking a passive solar approach to these buildings in integrating these sunscreens into the buildings. Those are not just decorative, though they're very pretty. I like them. But he is integrating them into the architecture. And then, of course, the landscaping as well, the pools of water, the patterns, and he's bringing these all together. If it's a building that's worth studying a lot more. But you have this, this double columns. And then look at how some of these railings and other details, features, patterns of the pavements and so forth. These are all being integrated. So he's looking at this as a whole, putting them together, but it's not a glass box. It's something much more interesting and more decorative and also functional. This is also a building that we are currently fighting to try to save. But the late modern in general, so I was trying to go beyond what the international style had presented. It took many different approaches. One was geometry, form, and not just a cubic box, but in the case, again, another Pereira building, the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco, a pyramid as well, and a landmark. Really, one interesting thing about Pereira, I hate the word iconic. It's just thrown around so much. But how do you do a building which is truly iconic, a building that stands for something more than it was, a real landmark? It stands for more than just its own use as a building. And Pereira has an extraordinarily high batting average for those sorts of landmarks. Transamerica Pyramid, the theme building at LAX, Geisel Library. How do you do that without going over the top and just being undisciplined and just doing something splashy, but having something which really sticks in the public mind? That's an extraordinary talent, and Pereira had it. In the residential area as well, no more of the glass box, the Kaufman House by Richard Neutra, for example, but you have Ken Kellogg and you have John Lautner exploring new geometries, new forms, new shapes, still modern materials, modern structures, but exploring, experimenting, pushing how they are done. In the commercial world as well, this is a Bullock's building by Welding Becket, one of the largest corporate firms in California and in the nation actually at the time. But look at the geometry of that model. This is a piece of sculpture. And it was a department store, of course, at a shopping mall. You see one variation of that in what is now the Macy's at South Coast Plaza as well. And you see how Becket translated those sculptural forms, the massing of them, into the materials, the metal and the brick and so forth. And for what? For a department store, or a building that people would be using every day. An ordinary building, not a Capitol or an art museum or whatever, but a department store. That's an important part of spreading this idea of modernism. Other geometries, hexagonal buildings as well. Again, getting away from the square and expanding. Of course, Frank Lloyd Wright explored this in many of his houses as well, but this expanded up into office buildings, larger buildings. This is a building by Stuart Williams out in Palm Springs for the Eisenhower Medical Center as well. And in the bottom shot of this, you see how perspectives of the building are beginning to change. If you're not just looking at a right angle, but you're looking at these oblique angles as well. And this was carried on into, for example, shopping malls. This idea of, notice how, the roofscape, notice how the balconies are all creating this flowing line, this carrying around corners, not with hard rectangular lines, but these more flowing in and out, sinuous even lines. And this again was carried on even into, for example, this detail of the railings as well. This chamfered line, this crystalline form. So the late modern was using these sorts of forms as well to enrich modernism. I throw this in as well. It is a box, but notice the sorts of details, the curving lines, very subtle. At the roof line, as well as over the right over the entryway as well. The colors. This is again another another department store or a box, and it was designed by Cesar Pelli in the early 1970s. It was a prototype, and you will find these buildings still, no longer Orbach, but you will find these buildings in older shopping malls around the state as well. Raising the question. Is this historic? Is this a landmark? Should this sort of building be saved? Fortunately, I'm the first one talking today, so I don't have to answer all these questions. I'm just going to raise them. And our smart panel later in the day will be able to continue with it. Campus planning as well. Large-scale master planning of campuses, of neighborhoods, of cities as well. An important part of the late modern approach. This is the library at Cal State Dominguez Hills by A. Quincy Jones and Frederick Emmons. And as I was mentioning earlier, the landscaping is by Robert Herrick Carter. The landscape architects deserve as much research and attention as the building architects. And it's especially important in this building because it's built on a grid that Quincy Jones laid out, but it has all of these different levels. So modernism is playing with the flat plane, and it's digging down and it's building up and it's protruding out over and so forth. This integration of the building and the landscape is particularly well done at Cal State Dominguez Hills. These fins up here, the library, again, are a passive solar element integrated into the architecture. Now, one of the most difficult challenges that we have right now is this building. This is an addition, early 1970s addition to the LA Times building. There on the, right here, you see the original 1933 LA Times building by Gordon Kaufman. An extraordinary building, just an incredibly important building, and an expression of modernism in the early 1930s, which is not international style, but it's still modern, coming out of California. But In the early 1970s, a new publisher, Otis Chandler, took over the LA Times, was going to expand it, make it not just a regional powerhouse, but an international powerhouse of a newspaper. He was upgrading the standards of the newspaper, wanted to be taken seriously for its reporting and its opinion. So he hired who? William Pereira, one of the most important architects working at that time, to design this edition. Now, it is a challenging building. We cannot look at it in the same way that we look at additions to buildings today, which is a subject we are going to be talking about later. Those were not really ideas in discussion at that time. So, for example, right here, his building joins the historic 1933 building, and it removed a great deal of fabric from, which was really quite nice. They were kind of buttresses from the original building. See a little bit of the original building here. So that it's being, it's being kind of dovetailed into it. But what makes people really hate this building today, and whenever it is reported on Curbed LA or in the press in general, you get just a whole set of people saying, oh, what an ugly building, let's get rid of it. Partly because it's dark, it seems to kind of loom over the sidewalk. It definitely expresses power, which it was meant to. The LA Times is the most important, one of the most important political institutions in California, and this building expresses it. But it does have many redeeming characteristics. Actually, at the sidewalk, it creates a small plaza with planters in front, and there was a bank in here in the entry to the building. And the overall massing actually relates in many ways to brutalist buildings that we're going to be seeing. It has this composition of verticals and horizontals, which are really quite strong. Modern materials, it's not concrete, it's stone and it's steel and glass. As you take a building like this, a building which is very difficult today for many people to understand, again, talking about this cycle of preservation, this building is right at the bottom of its cycle, right at the moment, which is also when it's most vulnerable. And yet, it was a major building by a major architect. It has many characteristics and qualities to it, which I feel make it a landmark and should be fought for. A tough job, I know, but I promise that, if it is torn down, as it most probably will be, replaced with a high-rise tower, in 10, 15 years, we'll say, why did we do that? That was really a great building. The LA County Museum of Art, as well, as I mentioned, also by William Pereira. Really sad case study in terms of maintenance over the years. In the LA County building, the LA County did not put enough resources into maintaining it. So the building structure and facilities have degraded today. Did not have to, but they have. But then also, before we go on, I want to point out again, what the original building was. Late modern, not a box, but structurally expressive with these verticals, but they are treated almost like sinew. They have a kind of a sinuous quality to them. They aren't an I-beam. They're more sculptural, and they meet the sky. But then especially look at what's going on in the foreground. Water. Thomas Church was the landscape architect of this. Water, sculpture, light standards, railings, plazas, steps, artwork and sculpture as well on these. A public place facing onto Wilshire Boulevard as well. This is what LA County Museum of Art is proposing to replace the entire original William Pereira campus with. This is by Peter Zumthor, and somebody who does not really understand Los Angeles. It is a large blob, irregularly shaped, It will bridge over Wilshire Boulevard at this point as well. And the inspiration for it, Zumthor said, was the La Brea tar pits, which are right here by it, and which is why the original version of it was black. Now, this is the latest version of it, and it's become sandstone color of some sort. It's concrete. But notice the complete absence of any skyline. There's no city in his understanding of this building. Well, this is what happens when you tear down a good building and try to put in a poor design. Moving on, another type of 60s, 70s, and 80s buildings are mirrored glass complexes, office buildings, campuses, etc. Again, these are buildings which are often difficult for many people to understand, to appreciate, to like. But here are some examples. On the right, the Bonaventure Hotel by John Portman. On the left, top, is an office complex in Indianapolis by Kevin Roach, of Roach and Dinkaloo. And the bottom left is an interior, a bar at the United Nations Plaza, a building across from the United Nations, also by Roach and Dinkaloo. And this building, incidentally, has just recently become a New York City landmark, again, with right documentation and efforts and work by preservationists. But what do we see in these buildings? We see the skin, the mirrored skin, the glassy skin. But we also see these geometries, new geometries being introduced into architecture, no longer just boxes. We see these crystalline, chamfered sorts of forms. Now there's a big history, a long history to mirrored glass. It really goes back to the General Motors Technical Center, which opened in 1956, designed by Eero Saarinen and his staff including Kevin Roach, incidentally. But what they were discovering, and this is such a fascinating building. Again, this is a building which is just considered to be a Miesian ripoff, basically. There are a lot of square boxes led around, set on a grid around the campus as well. But there's so much more to this building. Because in the front here we have, I think that's boy, I get Oldsmobiles and Pontiacs mixed up in this area. It's one or the other, a General Motors design. And of course, every car has a windshield. And how did General Motors, the largest corporation in the world, spend incredible amounts of money on technological research, on materials and structures and so forth? How did they keep that glass for the windshield in the frame of the metal building? Well, they had come up with neoprene gaskets, rubbery gaskets as well, which were flexible, so the rattling of a car going down the road would not bust this glass out of its frame. It had some give. It was a technological invention. And Eero Saarinen, Kevin Roach, and their entire team worked with Harley Earl, the head of automotive design at General Motors, and they learned from Harley Earl. And they looked at the technology that General Motors was developing. So they said, why can't we do that with buildings? So they set these large glass panes in neoprene gaskets and created the whole building. Well, this excited Kevin Roach. It excited also Caesar Pelli and Anthony Lumsden, who were also on Eero Saarinen's team on General Motors Technical Center. And so in 1956 was the GM Tech Center. By the late 1960s, these architects were exploring how to keep a piece of glass in a frame without the traditional way of doing it. And this is the first building designed that really used glass as a skin, not as a piece of glass set in a metal frame, but glass as a skin that went all the way around the building. And you can see that the way it's being used. It's taut. It is like a skin. You don't see the structure underneath. In fact, this building is not, it's kind of levitating. It's almost like a blimp in its proportions, in its shapes, in its colors as well, which is appropriate because it was the headquarters for the Federal Aviation Administration in El Segundo in Los Angeles. And this was designed by Cesar Pelli and Anthony Lumsden, taking these ideas from GM Tech Center and creating a new aesthetic expression for the glass. You're no longer the Miesian I-beam expressed on the top. In fact, they reversed it. The I-beam is hidden behind the glass so that you have this continuous skin. Cesar Pelli, of course, took this idea and went in again in many other directions as well. This is the Pacific Design Center from 1975, same sort of glass skin, but again, he's using it in a sculptural way in a different format as well, and a different color. Exploring, experimenting with the possibilities of this material. Now, Cesar Pelli's influence was not only from Eero Saarinen and the technology as well. He was looking at a lot of art as well. In the upper right-hand corner, there is an art installation by the artist Larry Bell, who used glass and explored its reflective qualities as well, especially in multiple versions as well. And Cesar Pelli was looking at these when he was designing buildings like the Pacific Design Center. New colors, new shapes, reflectivity, dematerialization, all of these characteristics. And I do have to thank my friend Daniel Paul, who's a historian up in Los Angeles. He has done incredible research on the history of the mirrored glass buildings. Many others, many other possibilities for the mirrored glass. On the left is a Great Western Bank building in Los Angeles by William Pereira, again taking a different form. And Langdon Wilson designing a number of office buildings using this very plain mirrored glass grid across the buildings. Moving on now to what I prefer to call béton brut, because brutalism is such a bad word. How could anybody like brutalist architecture? So we'll call it béton brut. It, of course, has many roots. The Smithsons in England, but especially Paul Rudolph, that's the Yale architecture school in the lower left-hand corner by Paul Rudolph. And again, you see this interplay of verticals and horizontals as well. And the verticals are often stairways or service spaces as well. And you see that, again, here in San Diego at UC San Diego as well, in this complex at Muir College as well. Also concrete. Béton brut, of course, means raw concrete. And that is the core of brutalism, that you are taking concrete and you're not cladding it, you're using it, exposing the concrete, poured monolithic concrete. And whether it's a waffle pan, as you see on the right, or it's poured, then the question is, how do you treat the skin? How do you treat the exterior of it? Many different ways to do that. Board form, chiseled, exposed aggregate, etc. And there have been any number of great buildings. This is a building, this was the Fremont City Hall by Robert Mittelstadt from the mid-1970s. A really marvelous building, not just brutalist, but a megastructure. It was designed really to kind of continue in a coil forever, to expand. So it had expansion characteristics built into it. That was the city council chamber, this large mass up at the top. This building, however, has been demolished. The Oakland Museum, as well, by Roach and Dinkloo. You see also exposed concrete, massive forms, very simple sorts of details, composition of just the large concrete forms. This building was remodeled a couple of years ago, and that's why I'm including it here, by Mark Cavagnero. And this is how he has reinterpreted the entry to the building as well. It had been a large uncovered entryway into the galleries, stepping down in a large circulation pattern down into the building. The building has a garden on the roof of it. It's a really great building. But there were some functional problems, and in the past couple of years, this was part of the way that it was added to as well. Question it raises, is this appropriate? Should these buildings be, how much do you respect the original character, concept of the architect? How much do you have to change it? Are there functional, practical reasons for changing? And then how do you do it? How well do you do it? The sculptural characteristics, a sinuous character that's possible with poured in place concrete, both in Century City on the right by Welding Becket in this crosswalk over Avenue of the Stars, and also in Dana Point Harbor in this bridge going out to an island in the harbor of the building, of the Dana Point Harbor as well. But notice, aspects of how concrete can be chiseled and formed and shaped to create this sort of strong, muscular characteristic of concrete. And of course, Geisel Library by William Pereira as well. A sense of uplift of this mass rising off of the ground, being lifted up, the structural strength of concrete, poured in place concrete being used as literally the structure holding the building in the air. New formalism is another style, another direction that these architects were taking in the 60s and the late 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. To say, again, that international style is not everything. There are more ways to do modern architecture. And we don't have to reject the past, for example. The rejection of the past was a theoretical stance that the Bauhaus architects took. And it came out of the social character of the Bauhaus in Europe in the 1920s. The past meant aristocracy, wars, oppression. The past was something to be forgotten, left aside in building a brand new modern world. So you can understand that the European architects were interested in doing away with history, ornament, Gothic ornament, classical ornament, whatever. It was all of the past that they wanted to forget. That wasn't so much true in the United States. History was not really as denigrated as it was in Europe. And you see that, again, in the work of Irving Gill here. When he came here, saw the missions. He worked on, restoring the mission San Diego. He understood the character. He wasn't concerned about the social meaning of these buildings. He was interested in how they solved the problems of building in this climate with these materials in a period in the past. And he used history in his buildings. Also using history are Edward Durrell Stone, for example, in the United States Embassy in New Delhi at the top, at Beckman Auditorium at Caltech in Pasadena, and then another important architect is Minoru Yamasaki, and this is an insurance company building in Minneapolis as well, which takes the Greek temple with all of its columns and updates it, makes it modern, not Corinthian capitals, but these very attenuated, tapered, modern sorts of forms. The Music Center by Welding Becket in Los Angeles as well. It's basically a Greek temple with columns along the front. But then he's playing with these ideas. Of course, the building curves at the side to kind of embrace the auditorium inside as well. And yet it is part of new formalism. Mormon Temples, got a great one here up in La Jolla as well. This is the one in West Los Angeles as well. Ahistorical in a traditional sense, not Gothic, not classical, but one which has its own integral sense of form, ornament, etc. Millard Sheets as well, especially in his home savings and loan association buildings, as you see in the upper right-hand corner as well. massive historic symmetry to it. And he even adds these wonderful stained glass windows and mosaics, which are an ancient art form, of course, these mosaics to the exterior of these buildings as well in the 1950s, 60s, and into the 1970s as well. He was an artist. He was also the architectural designer of these buildings. And he wasn't so interested in, he wasn't really trained as an architect, so he didn't know what he should have done. But as an artist, he understood vernacular buildings, he understood historic buildings, he understood old adobe Mexican buildings and other vernacular buildings around the world, historic history. And he brought these into his modern interpretation. On the lower left is the Masonic Temple on Wilshire, which he designed and built. And this has a fairly happy adaptive reuse. It was bought by the Marciano brothers and is now a museum. It stood empty. The Masonic Temple had stood empty for many years there in Wilshire. Nobody knew what to do with it, but it is now an art gallery. Postmodernism. This was probably the most extreme response to the failures of international style modernism. Many sources for postmodernism. Robert Venturi, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. Just an extremely important architectural treatise from the early 1960s about what architecture could be if we got out of this narrow mindset of the international style modernism. And of course, you have his addition to the La Jolla Art Museum. And again, it raises a whole set of questions that we'll be discussing later in the day. Charles Moore is another major contributor to the idea of an alternative modernism, a postmodernism, whether starting at Sea Ranch, where he, again, responds very much to the natural setting, the climate, the topography, and he borrows forms, again, from history, from mining buildings, from vernacular buildings, barns, and so forth of the area. But he takes these ideas and expands them throughout his career. The faculty club at UC Santa Barbara, lower left-hand corner, and the Lee Burns House, lower in the middle there, both take the California tradition of the stucco box, of stucco buildings, of Spanish buildings, of this thin, well, either adobe or a thin stucco skin to these buildings, and tile roofs. And how do you play with those forms as well to create a richer architecture, which wasn't going to be as boring as the international style? On the lower right is a small student center at UC Irvine that he designed later in his career. Here he is even more directly going towards historic European resources. This is almost a variation of a chapel from an Italian hill town, for example, and incorporating them into his works. Interesting, very early in Charles Moore's career, when he worked with Clark and Butler in San Francisco, he added this addition to this older building right on Market Street. And you see how even, and this is the early 1960s, how he is adapting a new building, a new addition to an old building as well. It's modern. Obviously, it is just a very straightforward, plain brick, none of the ornament that you see in the older building. But by carrying on the general proportions, lines, verticality of the original building, he is creating a new building which responds to the old building in different ways. Another good question for us to think about as we go forward in our discussion today. Michael Graves. On the left is the San Juan Capistrano Library that he designed in the 1980s, and then on the right, the Disney headquarters in Burbank as well. This is, again, part of postmodernism, which in many ways is difficult for people to swallow today. It is so fanciful. It is so different than the very serious, very rigorous buildings of Zaha Hadid or Tom Maine that we see and which are greatly honored these days. This brings color. It brings whimsy. It brings historical associations into architecture and then plays around with them. These are not replicas of historic buildings. They are building on historic buildings. And that to me is one of the best, most fruitful parts of postmodernism. This is a building which I like. It was a, not Great Western, it was a bank building up in the upper left-hand corner. I can't remember which bank it was, a chain here in California. And this was designed by one of my professors at UCLA, Tim Vreeland. And it was in many ways a kind of an homage to Adolf Loos's house for Josephine Baker. You see a model of that in the upper right-hand corner. You see these really strong vertical black and white lines as well, and chiseled window frames as well. And again, it was a bank in a shop on the edge of a shopping center. However, this was a building which had a legitimate architectural provenance in terms of its ideas, its concept, its architect. And yet, just within the last 2 years, it was remodeled as you see it in the lower right-hand corner. Has something been lost from the quality of our city streets when it goes from what it was to what it is now? We are about, as I said before, about trying to maintain, improve the quality of urban livability through design of buildings. And was this a step forward or a step back? Another important part of postmodernism, which again relates to the sort of fancifulness, the wit of Charles Moore in particular, was the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. These are some of the structures for the Olympics in Los Angeles, designed by both John Jurdy and also Deborah Sussman, the graphic artist as well. And here you see the color, the historical elements to make special a gateway, an entryway, a flag-bedecked canopy across the building. And of course, these are all very temporary buildings for the Olympics, but they are definitely strongly in the postmodern the postmodern movement of this time. This is the West Side Pavilion by John Jurdy, built at basically the same time as Horton Plaza as well. And here you see, historical elements, the circular top, the dual columns, the ornamental elements, the mosaic patterns, almost like like wallpaper on either side of the entryway, and all postmodern elements that were included there. But really, Horton Plaza is definitely his masterpiece of this era, of this type of postmodernism, a masterpiece of postmodernism as well. And you see all of these elements, historical elements, colorful elements, new geometries, public places, all brought together at Horton Plaza. Another aspect of postmodernism which was really gave birth to a lot of what was going on today, was the Venice School in Los Angeles, coming in along in the mid to late 1970s and 80s. This is kind of a historic photograph now of these what then young architects. On the left, Fred Fisher, then Robert Mangurian, Eric Owen Moss, Coy Howard, Craig Hodgetts, Tom Maine, and kind of the godfather of the group, Frank Gehry. And here you see what they were doing in the 70s and 80s, breaking away from modernism, breaking away from the strictures, California giving them the permission to try new things. So this is by Fred Fisher, a house in Venice. This is by Frank Israel, a house in Los Angeles. Frank Israel, another kind of member of this group. The Gagosian Gallery by Hodgetts and Mangurian in Venice. A house, actually a townhouse by Errico and Moss in Playa del Rey, a house in San Pedro by Coy Howard, and a restaurant, Cape Manalini, by Michael Rotundi and Tom Main as well. And in these postmodern buildings, you see the experiment variety, using modern materials, using exposed steel, exposed plywood, exposed stucco, in fairly severe effort often. But then this kind of, and I use this in a positive way, this pastiche, this collage of bringing together a lot of elements, reflecting interior plans, but also reflecting new symbolism, especially in the Errico and Moss building, this kind of retro Buck Rogers sort of style to it. And the Coy Howard building in the lower center is almost a predecessor of Star Wars as well, very futuristic, but angular, harsher in the use of the materials. This is a bank building by Frank Gehry, again using force perspective play to create a new set of forms. Far from the ideas of the international style, far from the ideas of Bauhaus. And of course, here in San Diego, you have a similar group of people working together in their own ideas here. This is the Linda Vista Library by Rob Wellington Quigley. And you see this exploration of new ideas, new directions as well going on. Very exciting. The thing is, San Diego, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area in the 70s and 80s had similar uprisings of young architectural talent, stretching their wings, trying new ideas, throwing out the rules, seeing what new rules might actually work in this new period, responding to new ideas. I find this library particularly interesting because it is at Linda Vista, which was originally in the shopping center building in the early 1940s by Whitney Smith, an extraordinary example of master planning of a community, residential, and social center and shopping center, all designed all at once. And here's an example of it, again, using sunscreens and passive solar elements in the design of it. And this is Quigley's addition to this complex. The shopping center by Whitney Smith, of course, does not exist anymore, unfortunately. We lost it. It was a very important landmark, but it was lost long ago. A couple of examples of a sustainable design. These are two examples of buildings at UC Irvine by William Pereira. And again, we've talked about this before, the way he integrated passive solar elements in these sunscreens into the architecture of the building, how sculptural those elements are. Another building, this is at Stanford by Harry Wiese, the Terman Engineering Building. Very thin building because it was designed to be without mechanical air conditioning. So there was air circulation through this thin building, through the offices of the building, as well as a vertical circulation for air circulation as well. This is another view of that same building. It was a heavy timber building as well. But because of poor maintenance over the years by Stanford University, this is what it looks like now. It was torn down a couple of years ago by Harry Wiese, major Chicago architect, doing, for the early 1970s, exploring new ideas for modern architecture and its application, especially in terms of passive design. Something went wrong. Okay, sorry about that. So office parks, we're getting into now not just styles, but a couple of different types of buildings from this period, which we should be thinking about in terms of buildings types for nominations, for maintaining, preserving buildings, because they are part of an urban fabric. Great, thank you, John. General Dynamics office park, again by William Pereira, with this wonderful ramp that went up, and as I understand, this building does not exist anymore. But the idea of, let's see, Mike, okay. Good, good. But these large complexes, research or office parks as well, part of the suburban development of California. Shopping malls, office parks, school campuses, community college campuses, these large collections of buildings, which were often, they had many really good architects designing them originally. But what happens when those master plans become 30, 40, 50 years old? There's a demand for new buildings, additions, of course. But do you follow the original plans, or do you contradict those earliest plans? And those are ideas which, again, we'll talk about later. The office parks, these really deserve more study as well. This is by Langdon Wilson in Irvine as well, using mirrored glass, but also the way that it uses it. It's integrated into the landscaping. So you have the reflectivity of the glass, you have the outdoor courtyards as part of this office park. Really a very pleasant sort of work environment. In the office parks, you see, again, on the upper left-hand corner, a Langdon Wilson design using mirrored glass, but in a natural landscape, using the reflectivity of the building itself. The landscaping here was by Emmett Wemple, the great landscape architect. And in the other examples on the right, you see the not only mirrored glass, but the crystalline, chamfered forms of buildings from the 1970s. Shopping centers, of course, another suburban site. Oftentimes we are dealing with suburban building types when we're dealing with the 1970s and the 1980s. The suburbia is as important an urban concept as the center city. And many really important architects used that, explored that, were innovative in designing for suburban types and shopping centers and housing tracts and so forth, especially in this period of great expansion. So what do we do? The shopping center, of course, has a great history. These are very early examples from 1947. Upper left-hand corner, the mill irons in Westchester by Victor Gruen with parking on the roof. You came down escalators into the interior of the building. There are many functional reasons for that. And then the Bullocks Pasadena on the right by Werdeman and Becket as well. A building which, the building still stands, but it has some very unfortunate additions which have been built within the last 10 years. Or also by Victor Gruen, the Northland Shopping Center in Detroit as well. This is a major historic landmark in the history of American culture, economy, urban development, society. The idea, because this was not the first shopping mall, but it was the first where all of the primary concepts were brought together. The parking, the circulation, the different buildings, indoor, outdoor spaces, art involved with it as well in the outdoor social public spaces. When Victor Gruen designed this building, he was thinking about his upbringing in Vienna. He loved Vienna to the end of his life. He loved the cafes and the street life and the music and the performances of old Vienna. And he was translating those into American suburbia. Extraordinary design. This is what it looks like today. It's going to be torn down. and replaced with some, I haven't seen what was going to be done with it now. Large piece of property, valuable piece of property, pressures to develop it are great, but you're losing an important part of the history of our development and the ideas that Victor Gruen originally had and put into the shopping center. Not always well interpreted by other people, but you have to respect what the original concept was. A couple of other shopping centers. This is Fashion Island in Newport Beach, as it originally was built by Welding Becket. And this is a more recent view of it as well, added on to changed, flexible, changing over time as needs be. And of course, it is now not just a shopping center, but it is an office center as well, and a residential area beyond it as well. A reinterpretation of downtown with all of its functional purposes and social purposes. And of course, the additions here in the center were done by John Jurdy in the 1980s and 90s. But in the original buildings by Welding Becket and William Pereira, you see elements, the use of columns, but they are these modern sculptural columns. And of course, you have this issue rising at Mission Hills, Mission Valley, in the shopping centers there, and at Horton Plaza. Stadiums, I just want to throw in as one more example as well. The top of the view is Candlestick Park, which is now gone. A great expression of modern architecture, late modern architecture, concrete architecture. Another example with a very unfortunate addition is Oakland Stadium by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. And over the years, these additions have been added for clubhouses and other things. It was just this very simple rotunda or drum with the structural column, structural X's on the exterior, but with signage, with additions as well. The original concept has been greatly diminished. Master plan campuses, Gruen, opened in 1965. The idea that you could solve the problems that they were seeing in suburbia, the long stretches of kind of discriminate commercial strip, the lack of amenities, of parks, of schools, of libraries. They weren't distributed. And by rational modern planning, you could bring those all together and create an ideal suburban village. So, for example, here at University Park, you see green belts running through the entire place. You see clustered homes, and you see single-family homes for different economic levels to live side by side. Pools, school, library was built right up here, and all rationally planned so that you had the right number of parks, recreation areas, schools, libraries for the population that you planned here. The architecture also with townhomes which shared a wall. These are actually two homes. This is the dividing line. But you see that across the, instead of having a lot of cracker box houses or a lot of different styles of houses, you have a unity to the streetscape, the setbacks, the height limits, the materials were all unified. So you had a sense of unity and yet also a sense of diversity. Following the original master plan guidelines of William Pereira. Here's a view of one of the green belts as well, with townhomes against it. The university, which was the anchor for Irvine as well, also planned by William Pereira with, this is an aerial view of the original one, with the Circle Road, and each of the different disciplines have their own complexes, which could be expanded out and access going in this direction. Using the natural topography of the land. Century City by Welding Becket as well, a large master planned center. Dana Point Harbor as well, a recreational master planned community, or not a community, but facility as well for the city, using late 70s or early 70s California modern styles. Open, glassy, casual, exposed wood, post and beam structures. So, with the buildings from the 70s and 80s, is remodeling, how do you add to it? Do you demolish them? How do you alter them? What's the impact of deferred maintenance? And then can we recreate these buildings as well? As I said, this all goes in a cycle. Every style that we now value was once considered unimportant. This is a 1902 house in Pasadena by the Green brothers. Today, one of the most venerated architects in California. Well, in the 1950s, it was remodeled as this. And it was done by a very distinguished architect, Whitney Smith. But it just goes to the point that in the 1950s, craftsman style was not considered at all important, just as today we do not consider brutalism important, we do not consider postmodernism important. These things inevitably change. On the upper left-hand corner is a supermarket in Highland Park, a very good original Googie-style supermarket, and within the past couple of years is remodeled as this faux craftsman supermarket in order to, it was explained very carefully, to keep in the proper context of the craftsman buildings in Highland Park. The Crystal Cathedral, Robert Schuller's church up in Garden Grove as well. Here you see it, there you see him preaching both to his indoor congregation and the outdoor congregation in the parking lot. Come as you are in the family car. And this recently was bought by the Catholic Diocese, change in religions, but the Catholic Diocese has done a really great job of restoring this original building by Richard Neutra, and is using it today. However, there is also this 1980 building, the Crystal Cathedral itself, by Philip Johnson, which you see at the top there. The lower left-hand corner is the original interior. And Schuller told Philip Johnson that he wanted to preach under God's sky, God's clouds. And so it is an entirely glass structure. This did not fit the needs of the current diocese of the Catholic Church when they took it over. And this on the right is the changes that they are making to that interior. They didn't want so much light. They wanted to make it a little bit darker, or to be able to control that. So actually they came up with a system of kind of mechanisms which would open and close so that they can control the light that was coming in. Also reorienting it to their instead of being centrally organized, it's now linearly organized. Is this appropriate? Is this what you do with a building? A changing function? We need to have adaptive reuse, but how do you do it? The May Company, 1940, by A.C. Martin. You see its original view in the lower slide. It has now become the museum of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and Renzo Piano has added this addition, which is under construction right now, which you see at the top, this great dome, globe, whatever it is. They did cut the original building in half. The original building actually was only this far. It was added on in the 40s here. They've cut this part out in order to create the space for this entire new building. An addition. Is that appropriate? Does that fit in with the original building? Should it? But one of the worst examples is, again, LA County Museum of Art. Here you see it as it originally was built. This is Wilshire Boulevard, and as you can see, the campus was quite open to Wilshire and the public in this way. In the mid-1980s, Hardy Holzman Pfeiffer added this wing right in this void right here. Very tempting. Here you see it again from an aerial view as well. This was at a time when late modern architecture, William Pereira, were completely dismissed. It was very unimportant, bottom of the cycle, very definitely. So Hardy Holzman Pfeiffer saw nothing wrong with simply adding on this, filling in this gap, destroying the plazas, destroying the water features, and creating this monolithic building right on Wilshire Boulevard. To me, this is a great design mistake. It does not work at all with the original building. In fact, they were going to reclad all of the original buildings to fit the new buildings, thus disappearing the entire original campus. So I present that as an example. Marine Land of the Pacific, gone. A Frank Gehry building from the mid-1980s, no, actually 90s, at the University of California, Irvine. This is a picture of it being demolished for a new building. Oakland Airport by John Carl Warnecke. You see it in the upper left-hand corner. And several years ago, they added this shelter along the car pedestrian drop-off point, which completely obscures the original content of the arched building. Now, not all buildings are equal. A building like the Kaufman House by Richard Neutra in Palm Springs is an extraordinary piece of architecture, truly iconic in its way. And in the 1990s, it was restored painstakingly to its original plan after many years of misuse. Should that level of restoration be applied to, for example, a ranch house in a ranch house subdivision? Question to be discussed. Buildings like Steinhaus Hall at University of California, Irvine by William Pereira with these integral sunscreens that we've been talking about as well, was remodeled a couple of years ago as this. A very good example of an anonymous office park building, which you can find anywhere in the United States. Long Beach City Hall by Gibbs and Gibbs. You see the roof garden of this megastructure as it originally was designed. Peter Walker was the landscape architect, but because of poor maintenance over the years, it was abandoned, neglected. This is what it looks like. This building is now so terrible, so hated, that the city is going to tear it down as well. And then replicas. Recognize this building? This is a replica of falling water somewhere in East Europe. I can't remember exactly where. And then, but a little bit better on the lower slide, this is a brand new Eichler house that has been built out in Palm Springs, according to the original plans as well. Is that an appropriate response to historic preservation? So, to wrap up, I believe in California. I believe in California's architectural history. I believe some of the best architecture that has ever come out of California has been the result of understanding its history and continuing that history and building on that history. In the early 1900s, we had Julia Morgan, Bernard Maybeck, the Green brothers, designing in new and fresh ways, ways which I consider modern, for the times, new materials, new formulations, marvelous outpouring of creative ability throughout California. Could include, of course, Irving Gill in the same group. And the next generation, William Worcester, Warren Callister, Charles Moore, many others, come in the 30s, 40s, 50s, up into the 60s, understood, loved, built upon that tradition as they went forward and moved architecture forward. This, to me, created a remarkably consistent, creative architecture over time. That's the real challenge here in San Diego, I think. San Diego has this incredible heritage of innovative ideas, new ideas about modern architecture. We have these buildings which remind us of that. What are we to do with them? And then how our architects today to carry on in new buildings or additions, remodelings, etc. It's a real question, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the day where we can discuss it further. So thank you very much. We still have a little more time if we have any questions. Be glad to bring them. Can you come up and use the microphone, please? So, okay. Oh, good.
I was just curious, what are some of your favorite buildings in San Diego from this period of the late 60s, 70s, and 80s that you think might be underappreciated or overlooked?
Well, the design center, Lloyd Rocco. I mean, I think you probably appreciate it here. I hope, but it should be known, nationally. That is just such an incredible interpretation of, modern materials, steel, glass, for a remarkable site as well. Very creative. Nothing like it in a steel and glass building anywhere else in California, certainly. The organic tradition, Sim Bruce Richards, Fred Liebhardt, and others as well. Very strong. Of course, La Jolla Museum had an exhibit on these a year or so ago. The organic tradition is such a strong thread through American modernism, and it's often kind of dismissed as well. So let's see, other examples. Well, nothing comes to mind at the moment, but I always love driving around San Diego.
What would you do if a developer wants to tear down a historic building and proposes the idea of relocating the historic building to another site? Is that a good solution, or is it possible to incorporate the historic building into a new development, or would it be better to tear it down and build something new that looks like the original historic building? Because these historic buildings, they occupy a lot of key land, and in areas where there's a drastic shortage of housing and where the needs of the community are different than they were when the building was originally built. And a lot of people feel that sometimes these historic buildings are more of a liability than an asset to the community. So how would you deal with that?
Yeah, very good question, very practical one. Issue of moving a historic building. That can depends upon the individual example, of course, whether it's physically possible or not. Then there's a question of should it be moved or not? Is the relationship of the building to the landscape so critical to the design of the building that that should not be disturbed? That's an important question. But yeah, there are examples where historic buildings have been moved and successfully. And so it's not the ideal solution, but it is a solution, because we're always dealing with a spectrum of relativity in terms of preservation between restoring a building and demolishing a building. We'd rather restore it where it is, but that's not always possible. What are the alterations, additions, or moving that might be able to at least save this sort of asset in some way? Now, how is that done? What is the new setting? What new additions might be added to it are all a question to me of design, of good design. And good design is an important part of this equation, I feel. That's why architects need to be sensitive to the original concept of the building when they are changing or altering it in any way. The other answer I would have to that is, is there a more profitable use for a site than to leave a historic building there? I think we need to honor adaptive reuse. This is often not done. Often the default position is simply tear down the old building to build the new. I think we need to have an ethic where we really do seriously consider adaptive reuse of buildings. And there are any number of good examples of adaptive reuse of buildings that can be pointed to. I just don't think they're considered carefully enough. for example, the LA County Museum of Art. It could have been added to bring it up to date in terms of gallery usage, et cetera. That was not seriously considered for that sort of major building. Again, the default position was tear it down, build something entirely new. So it's a good question. I hope we'll talk more about it and get other people's answers later in the day.
Question from online.
Good.
Please expand your thought about the thread of organic architecture in San Diego. For example, Bruce Richards from the 1950s to 1980s, carrying craftsman thought and Wright into the late modern period.
Yes. Up through and into the 50s and 60s, organic architecture, people associated with Frank Lloyd Wright or people influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, not necessarily as students, were a tremendous counterbalance to the international style. And it was particularly prevalent here in San Diego. A number of Wright's students settled here, but then you also have the original work of Ken Kellogg, for example, that really took those ideas and spread them. So those are all really important parts of the San Diego heritage as well. Let's see, did I answer the question? Was there another part to it?
It appears so. I actually had a question myself. So yeah, I love that you include the Charles Moore addition to Mutual Savings Bank, which is actually right across the street from CPF.
Yes.
And I get to appreciate it every day. And there was a wonderful quote from Charles Moore about respecting the past and treating the past like a friend and having sort of a handshake with the building next to it or something like that. But I also wondered what your thoughts were about the concept of a master architect, for example, because you described Pereira a lot, but I wonder, and I think I've encountered this in other eras of architecture where a certain architect is given all the credit, but a whole team is working for him who's contributed to that building. And then those younger architects tend to go on and build things themselves, and they may not be recognized for their work.
Okay, you just actually touch a really raw nerve for me right now. Because just this last week, I've been helping a group of people to save a house in Belvedere by Aaron Green. Beautiful 1961 house. Aaron Green, of course, was an associate of Frank Lloyd Wright's, a student, and then the only architect ever to actually be an associate of Frank Lloyd Wright in an office in San Francisco. But this question, Frank Lloyd Wright's definitely a master architect, but the other side was saying, who's Aaron Green? He's not a master architect. We can tear down his house easily. The whole idea of a master architect is a little strange. I wasn't taught about master architecture at school, architecture school. It's this kind of concept which has been brought up, I suspect, by lawyers in order to try to categorize certain people as important, others as not important. We need to, explore that whole assumption as well. But because Aaron Green was only a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's, they said, oh, well, Wright's the important one, Aaron Green isn't. Well, Aaron Green had his own very creative career outside of what he worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. That deserves to be honored. In my sense of what a master architect, he was a creative, original master architect doing major projects over the course of his career. So we need to look at that issue of what a master architect is and not get hung up on it too much. So, any other questions, or you've been good to sit?
None from online, so any others from the room? Well, thank you, Alan.
Okay, thank you.